This is a story about 3 doors that I was commissioned to make somewhere around December of 2016. And it's taken me quite a while to get to them. These doors are in the same style of some other pieces of furniture that I made for these same clients with the walnut strips through them. I've done a couple of credenzas for them, as well as a table base in this style. I started the construction of the doors by cutting the pieces out of plywood and then cutting the joinery with my domino. When I took this commission, I had no idea just how much trouble these doors would give me, but more on that later. With all the pieces cut out and the joinery cut, I needed to edge band all of the plywood, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm using solid wood edge banding and some tape to hold it in place while the glue dries. Through this whole process, I had been brainstorming on ways how I could cut all of the dados to accept the walnut strips in the rails and stiles of these doors. My first thought was to use a router and a reference key glued to the bottom of my router, but as we'll soon see, that did not pan out. And so with all of the edge banding attached on the outside faces, it was time to put the edge banding on the interior edges of the door. And so that's what I'm doing here, just marking it to length and cutting it to fit. I really wanted to figure out a way to cut these dados on the table saw, but cutting dados the length of an 8-foot board across the grain didn't seem like it could easily be done on a table saw, so I came up with the router idea, and it seemed in my mind that it would work just fine. So finally, with all of the edge banding attached, I need to cut the slot where the glass will fit into the door, and I'm just doing that here on my table saw, making sure that the curve that I'm cutting is centered on the edge of the wood. And with that taken care of, I can go ahead and do a quick dry fit to make sure that the glass actually fits in the door. So back to the router issue. I clamped a straight edge along my workpiece so that I could cut a rabbet on the very edge with my router. I would then glue a strip onto the bottom of my router to use as a reference key that was exactly 3/4 of an inch away from my bit, and this would give me the 3/4 inch spacing that I need between each dado. I would cut one dado, put the reference strip into that dado, and then cut the next. It seemed, in my mind, like this would work perfectly. My mistake, however, was that I used hot glue to attach the... As a result, the reference key on the bottom of my router moved, which meant that all of the dados I was cutting were not lining up across the door, and they would not line up on the opposite face of the door. I ruined 1.5 doors doing it this way, and had to start completely over. I guess that's what I get for just going with something and not making sure that it's working the way it should. After remaking the pieces, I decided to dye the portions of the plywood now before cutting the dados, because I figured it might save me some time later, since I was now very far behind, and sometimes during a stressful project, you just gotta listen to music and kind of rock out a little bit during test fits. So my next thought was to use this giant dado sled that I made for my table saw, and this worked, but not without its own sets of issues. I ruined another door this way because of cumulative error in my sled. The runners in the miter slots had a little bit of play in them, as well as the reference key on top had a little bit of play in it. Over the course of an 8-foot door, this amounted to over 3/4 of an inch of cumulative error, which meant back to the drawing board. But eventually, I got it to work just fine, the strips fit in the way they were supposed to, and I could continue with this build relatively stress-free. And so after checking that everything is lining up the way it should, I could continue using the dado sled to cut a lot of dados. At this point in the build, I was just ready to be done with these doors. Unfortunately, I had a lot more work to do. I've never had this much trouble with a project, ever. And one would think it would be a relatively simple project. You build the rails and stiles for the door, cut the dados, cut the strips, and glue them in. And boy, was I wrong. And so after cutting all of the dados and the stiles, the long vertical parts of the door, it was time to cut a lot of walnut strips. I ended up cutting over 500 of these for the 3 doors that I was making. And with the strips cut, it's time to cut them to length. And like I said, I cut a lot of these. And then it was finally time to start gluing the strips in. I started only by gluing the strips into the spots in the stiles where they did not connect to the rails. I wanted strips in those spots that went the entire way across the door to add to its strength so that it wasn't just the dominoes holding it together. Most of the strips fit just fine. Some of them needed a little bit of finessing with a hand plane, but overall, aside from gluing in over 500 strips, this was pretty much uneventful. With all those strips put in, I could go ahead and glue the rest of the door together. And then, like I said before, glue the remaining walnut strips in to give the doors some added strength. And just to reduce the chances of breaking this glass, I had my wife come out and help me glue these together. And then it was time to glue in the remaining strips. And like I said, I felt like this would give the doors some added strength over just having the dominoes holding them together and having these strips cut into 3 different parts. And so next I could cut the doors to their final width using my track saw. And use a hand saw to cut through the remaining portions because the depth of cut on my track saw was just a little too shallow. It was at this point that I realized the doors still had an awful lot of flex in them, so I glued on walnut pieces to each side of them to prevent the doors from bending. And with the sides tacked in place, I can go ahead and tighten up the clamps and let the glue dry. The next step in these doors, and the light at the end of the tunnel, is finish prep. So I went through and I sanded everything, and then it was time to apply finish. And I masked off all the glass, and I sprayed these doors with several coats of shellac. And so when it's all said and done, I'm quite happy with the way the doors turned out. It was nice to be challenged and to overcome some problems, but I think it's safe to say that I will not be building doors like this again for quite some time. Alright guys, thanks for watching.